people to see the work that modern day apostles are doing in the kingdom.
Every true Christian is sent. It's just a matter of where.
Dr. Peter Gurry, thank you so much for joining me on Apostle Talk.
Hey, my pleasure, Dave. Glad to be with you.
What I want to do first is, what we're going to do is talk about very, very briefly about what Apostle Talk is. And then what I want to do is talk about your background, your story, how you got where you are, your books, etc. And then at the end, I want to hit on very broadly, what is textual criticism? What does it entail? It sounds kind of a negative sort of a thing in criticism, but why is it that that science is a phenomenal thing for Christians, and it builds our faith and our understanding of our Bible? Does that sound good?
Perfect.
Awesome. So Apostle Talk, just real quick, I know I'm talking a lot at the beginning of this, but the purpose of this is, I'm not saying that Dr. Peter Gurry is the 13th apostle or that you have apostolic authority. I am using that term apostle very loosely, simply to define someone who is sent. So the whole point of this is two guys sitting down talking, two people sitting down and talking about what God has done in their life and how they have answered that call. And the goal is to shed light on what you're doing, but also hopefully to inspire those people who are out there trying to figure out what God's call is for them in their life. Make sense?
Yep.
So on that note, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your background and how you got to be teaching and as an author, etc.
Sure. So I just for the most immediate background, I teach at Phoenix Seminary, which is a seminary in Arizona, and I teach New Testament, I teach Greek, I teach New Testament survey, and then I teach in my particular area of expertise, which we're going to talk about today, which is textual criticism.
Yes.
And I've been there for about 5 years. Your listeners might also want to know I also co-direct what's called the Text and Canon Institute there.
Yeah.
And
what is that?
More about, yeah, you can learn more at textandcanon.org, and that's canon, C-A-N-O-N, so not the gun, but the canon of Scripture is what we're talking about there. And really our goal there is to illuminate the history of the Bible. That's what we do, and we try to do that through resources that help lay people understand and appreciate how we got the Bible. So everything from like, what's the Hebrew text behind your Old Testament like? Where did it come from? To why does the ending of Mark have a line in front of it in my Bible and says some manuscripts do not have these next 12 verses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then everything up until translation as well. How do we get the English Bible? Why do translations differ? Why do we have so many today? All those kinds of questions that I might say serious Bible readers, or sometimes even very new Bible readers, have questions about. So we try to do that. We also try to do top flight scholarship and encourage that through academic conferences and publications, and then we also mentor students as well. So we have kind of a three-pronged approach, but the gist of it is we're trying to illuminate the history of the Bible, as I said. Now, how did I get there? Well, it's a bit of a story, but the short version is I have long been interested in how we got the Bible, and it really, for me, it goes back to high school when I had to take a foreign language. I had been homeschooled up to that point, and in 9th grade I went to a Christian high school in Cincinnati, where I'm from, and the guidance counselor gave me a choice between taking Spanish as my foreign language and Greek, New Testament Greek, because it was a Christian school. And I, for whatever reason, have never been drawn to things that it seemed like everybody was doing. And so, perhaps in a bit of a rebellious streak, I said, I'll sign up for Greek.
Nice.
So I did. And I ended up taking 4 years of Koine Greek in high school, which is fairly unusual today. And it was in that high school class, I think my sophomore or junior year, that we got our first Greek New Testaments. So up until then, we'd just been sort of learning from the grammar book, translating made-up sentences and that sort of thing. And then we got our Greek New Testament, and I was just kind of blown away, frankly.
Yeah.
I had sort of taken the English Bible for granted my whole life up to that point. Had read it as a kid. Obviously, I had gone to church, and so heard it in church. But I was really just fascinated by the fact that, okay, here was the thing behind the thing that everybody else at church is reading. And then when I got to Bible college after that, I learned that there were handwritten manuscripts behind my printed Greek New Testament. And it was sort of like going one step further back in the process. And so that just sort of really lit me on fire, and I was fascinated by this process. Then when I went to seminary after Bible college, I worked with a well-known professor named Daniel B. Wallace, who teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary and runs the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And essentially what they do is they travel overseas, usually to Europe, and they digitize Greek New Testament manuscripts and put them online so that anybody can look at them and study them. And
so how long?
Yeah.
Sorry. So what was your connection? Talk to me more about that. Well, and first, for the viewers' benefit, I want to show you this just real quick. So this is how you and I ended up getting connected. I just have to tell this backstory as it relates to yours. But so I'm done in December with my master's in biblical studies, and the textual criticism class was one of my favorites, absolutely favorites. Actually, it was my favorite class for the exact same reasons that you mentioned. And when we were in that class, looking at the original manuscripts just got me so excited. It was like, wow, that is so cool. That text is thousands of years old, and it's the basis for what we have now. Exactly what you were talking about. But Daniel Wallace was specifically one of the guys that was referenced. That then got me connected to the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And then I reached out to him to do this, and he specifically recommended you. But so I got to show people this. So this is one of the books that they have.
Yep, that's P45.
Yep. So tell me what I'm looking at here. What are we looking at?
That's one of the, I can't see what page you're on if you're in a Gospels or Acts, but that's one of the earliest copies of the Gospels that we have, the Gospels and Acts that we have.
Yep.
From usually dated the 2nd
9.
or 3rd century. Yep.
Yeah, it's Acts 9.
You can see it's pretty fragmentary, right? I mean, it's shredded. It looks like shredded wheat on the edges there. And one of the things that makes it significant, besides its early date, is that it's our only copy of just the Gospels and Acts. All the other copies we have are either just the Gospels or they're Gospels, Acts, and something else usually, right?
Okay, so this page that I'm to now, we're in Romans, and at the bottom of this, it says Chester Beatty Library. So talk to me about this and your involvement with this.
Yeah, so that's P46. The P just stands for papyrus, and 46 means it's the 46th papyrus that we cataloged as scholars. And it's housed at a library in Dublin, Ireland. And a number of years ago, I got to go on a team with Dan Wallace and the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and we digitized that manuscript. And those images with the black background, I actually photographed those with my teammate. And
that's so cool.
It was incredibly cool. They had a library staff person in the room with us the whole time.
Of course,
their job was to keep an eye on us. but also their job was to move the plates. All these papyri are in plates of glass, each one individually, and their job was to bring the plate from the cart that they brought them in on over to our camera stand. Yeah, and we did not do any of that, because if it had dropped, God forbid,
liability,
shattered, it's a huge liability. So the only thing we could do is, once they were set on our camera stand, then we could adjust them for the camera. But I'll tell just a little background. Those images with the black background were the most difficult to shoot.
Why?
Because we got all kinds of light glare off the glass. And so I spent about the first week of our shooting learning about polarizing lenses. Is that what they're called? Polarizing lenses?
Yes, exactly.
It's been years now. But I had to go to a little camera store there in Dublin and buy a polarized lens so that we could minimize that glare. It still caused some problems, and we had to set up we had this whole sort of apparatus to control the lighting, and ended up putting sort of black curtain over it. And it was a bit of a trial, but we managed to get them all photographed, and the resulting images in that book look pretty fabulous.
I know I'm putting you on the spot here. We didn't talk about this being what we discussed, but do you remember anything as far as the background of P46?
Oh, sure. Well, so, a couple things about it. One is it's in Dublin because it was actually purchased by a very wealthy, I think he was an oil tycoon, if I remember, or maybe a train. Is it your oil or trains? I can't remember. Okay. Back in, I think, the 19th century. His name is Chester Beatty. So Arthur Chester Beatty. And he is, at some point later in life, he moved to Europe and settled finally in Ireland. And so he left his whole collection. His collection had much more than just biblical manuscripts. He does have
Okay.
some of the most important biblical manuscripts, but he also has stuff from Asia. He has artwork. He had manuscripts. He had all sorts of stuff. And so, he had so much money, he left it in an endowment for this museum. So his whole collection, as I understand it, is there at this museum, and you can go see it. I think it's free. I think it's a free museum. And P46 in particular is important because it's the earliest substantial copy we have of Paul's letters. Right.
What year is it from?
I think it's dated second or third century.
Excellent.
I think probably third century if I remember right. But it's really early and it's complete, and it's a very good manuscript overall. The scribe tends to omit some things accidentally. That's one of the known sort of proclivities of that manuscript. But overall, especially where it agrees with other like 4th century manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus or Vaticanus that we can talk about later, it's a very good text overall. So,
well, we're in the midst of textual criticism now. We skipped completely. We jumped right from your story straight into it. As soon as as soon as we got the connection with you actually photographing these beautiful ancient papyrus. So let's talk about textual criticism just real quick. So right there, you just mentioned that P46 was that the scribe omitted a few things. Let's just back up just a little bit. What is the science of textual criticism?
Yeah, it's a good question. So
yeah,
it's the name can be misleading because people hear criticism and they think it's something negative, but really it's just a term that we use to describe any work on a text where the original has been lost and the copies that we do have don't always agree with each other. And when it comes to the Bible, of course, we're thinking about God as the ultimate author, but then the human author in particular, and we're asking ourselves the question, which text should God's people read, preach, do theology from, write songs based on, all that?
So I'm going to play advocate here of just going the opposite direction. So are you telling me that we do not have an original copy of what the apostles originally penned?
We do not have the original parchment and ink, no. And
So
no one should be surprised by that.
I know when I
They
first
are.
heard that,
Okay.
yeah, of course they are. Of course they are. Well, and skeptics immediately like, oh, well, then you can't trust the Bible at all. It's the telephone game. We only have copies of copies of copies. And that's actually a good plug-in for your book, Myths and Mistakes, about textual criticism, which speaks to that, about the fact that there are two sides of the spectrum, is that you have people who completely just deny the validity of the Bible altogether because we don't have the original, what are called autographs. And then you have the other side that holds that there are no mistakes whatsoever, and that the text that I have is 100% perfect without any errors. And so I'm talking too much. Speak to me about that dichotomy of in between, and why is it that the person who, as a Christ follower today, how can we be sure that our text, that this Bible is the inspired Word of God?
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so there's a lot there actually, because we've
absolutely
gone from text criticism, which is primarily a historical discipline. We're asking historical questions. And you don't necessarily have to be a Christian to do it, okay? In my opinion, to do. I think it's good if you are, but it's because I think it's good if you're. it's good no matter what you're doing if you're a Christian.
Amen.
In my view, but then there's the question of theology. So we need to try to work through both of those together. On the sort of more historical side, the simple reason why there are differences in our manuscripts is because copying by hand is hard work. Okay.
Tedious.
It's very tedious. So scribes sometimes left us little notes in their margins about how hard it was, and saying things like writing bows the back, and essentially gives you arthritis, in your fingers because it's tedious, and you're slumped over. Until later they didn't really work at desks. They tended to work on their own laps, so they really are bent over. And then the Bible's a pretty big book.
Huge.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the New Testament is quite a bit shorter than the Old Testament, but it's still a decent book. If you're going to try to make a copy by hand of the whole thing, that's a lot of work.
How long would that have taken a scribe?
Well,
do you have any idea?
It could have. It depends. So a full New Testament usually would have been the work of a team. Okay. So maybe they can do it in a matter of months. I don't know. I'm going to guesstimate and
Yeah,
say they
yeah.
could probably do it in 3 to 6 months if they're all working together. Maybe less for just the New Testament, but it's still a big project. And they're going to check each other's work if it's part of a team effort. Okay, so they're going to check each other's work and make corrections before it leaves the scriptorium, that sort of thing. But maybe more important than the time is the money. It would have been really
Okay.
expensive. A complete Bible. Okay, so Old and New Testament now. Like Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, one of our most important manuscripts of the New Testament, to be sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Has been estimated to have cost about a year's salary for a priest at the time.
Wow.
Okay, so I would say put this in perspective. Imagine at your church, if your church did not have a complete Bible, okay, and you formed a committee about this, because this is what churches do, right? You form a committee about this, and the committee says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put up the money to get a complete Bible this year, and all we're going to have to do is take the pastor's full salary for this year. And they go to the pastor. What's he going to say? He's going to say, well, can we just start maybe with the Gospels?
Yeah.
And then maybe the Pentateuch, and then next year, depending on how the budget is, we'll add to that. So, we live in a world with the most wide access we've ever had to the Bible in history.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have to be really careful not to project that easy and cheap access back onto the ancient world. Frankly, we also have to not project it onto everywhere in the world, because as we know, there are places in the world that still don't have access to God's word in their own language, right? But certainly we should not project it backwards onto
So they're making copies. Scribes are, whether it's a group or individuals, they're putting all this effort in to make these copies. But there's also the element of the papyrus itself, what they're actually writing on, and the fact that it doesn't last very long. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. So in the ancient world, you have essentially, you have different media you can write on. You could write on stone. Think maybe the 10 Commandments. Okay, that's not very common because it's hard, and it's not very portable, and you can't put very much on it. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes they use wood, although that doesn't work great either, because again, it's big, thick, and you can't put much on it. Clay tablets in the Old Testament. Clay tablets are very common. Okay.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the New Testament, by far the long writing is done on parchment, which is made from animal skin, or papyrus, which is made from a reed plant that grows in the Nile River. And papyrus is the cheaper of the two, but it's not as durable.
And it's also the basis of our word paper, is it not?
That's right. Yep, we get our word paper straight from the word papyrus.
From papyrus. Okay, so how long would papyrus, keeping in mind that these are traveling around, going from location to location in harsh environments, how long would a piece of papyrus last?
Yeah, it all is always going to depend on how much it's used and how it's taken care of, right? So P46 that you've got pictures of there obviously has lasted almost 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So clearly it can last for a very long time in the right setting. The best place for papyrus to survive is a hot, dry climate. Okay. So that's Egypt for the ancient world. Okay. But I would say, imagine a papyrus traveling around the Mediterranean, and if it's getting damp and it's getting used, it's hard to say how long. Maybe it lasts a couple hundred years. Don't know. Sometimes maybe less, sometimes more if they take good care of it, right? But clearly they realized that parchment, the animal skin, was the better option. And so most of our manuscripts are on parchment, and then later paper, but certainly parchment for the early ones, because it just is far more durable. Or another way to think of it is the papyrus manuscripts that we do have are far more often fragmentary than the parchment ones. Yeah. So like the pictures in that book, you can look at P45, and we were talking about earlier, they look like shredded wheat around the edges, right?
Yeah. They're small little chunks.
Yeah, it's the fibers of the papyrus. They actually laid them sort of crosswise.
Yeah,
and then let them dry out that way. That's what holds it together. But those fibers then eventually they start to fray, especially if it gets wet and then dries out. It gets wet and dries out.
So let's now move to this question of how can we be sure of the validity of our text, and to go that argument that we can't trust it at all because of the whole it's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation argument.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's helpful for people is to say, actually, let's just flip the question. Why do we need to start with the question, how can I trust it? And maybe pose the question, why should I doubt it?
Ah, okay.
I think a lot of people come to the Bible with the question, why should I trust it? And they don't realize that that's a question that's been foisted on them by the surrounding culture, where there's a lot of skepticism. And frankly, our culture is pretty naturally skeptical to any kind of authority.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, add even more skepticism when it's an old authority, because we tend to think whatever's new is true, right?
Yeah.
And we should just step back before we even think about text criticism and think of it a bit self-reflective about where we are coming from as the questioner. So I want to start actually by saying that, why should I doubt it? And where my manuscripts agree with each other, I shouldn't doubt it. I have no reason to doubt the text whatsoever. And they agree a lot of times, okay? I also shouldn't doubt it where there's a handful of manuscripts that disagree with the vast majority, okay? Especially if it's just like an isolated, difference here or an isolated difference there. Where P46, for example, even though it's very early, where it's all alone by itself, I don't really think we should give it much credence. There'd have to be a lot of other really good reasons to follow P46 when it's all alone, okay? But usually when it's all alone, I can just immediately say I don't have a reason to follow that
So
manuscript.
what you mean by that, when it's all alone, means it's isolated in the sense that other ancient manuscripts that you have don't have this one section, so therefore it's not backed up by a consistency.
That's right. Yep.
Excellent.
So we have lots of what listeners need to know is we have lots of copies of the Greek New Testament. Okay.
Yeah.
Well
Thousands.
over 5,000. Yeah, well over 5,000 when we take as a whole. But even just say something like Revelation, which has the least number of manuscripts, we're still talking about hundreds of manuscripts of Revelation. Okay. So where there's a difference only in a manuscript here or a manuscript there, we shouldn't have any doubt at all about what the original text of Revelation is, right?
So based on the volume, you can have you see it's the same, and all
That's
these.
right.
That's amazing.
And it's
That's
not
amazing.
because more is always better. It's just because an isolated reading is almost always the product of an individual scribe, right? Then beyond that, then we as scholars study these manuscripts, and where there are obvious mistakes. And the more you study manuscripts, the more of these obvious mistakes you can recognize. You then, even in places where, say, there isn't an issue of only one manuscript having a reading, you can still very clearly identify, hey, this is the kind of mistake that we see scribes make in copying, because copying by hand is hard. So we can dismiss that as well.
What are some examples of obvious mistakes?
So a very common mistake is a mistake where you have, say, a sentence or a couple lines in a manuscript where the same word gets repeated, okay? And a scribe, you have to remember, when a scribe is copying by hand, they're always going from one manuscript to the other. So they're going from the manuscript they're copying from to the manuscript they're creating from scratch, right? And so their eyes going back and forth. The pen is being lifted and put down again, being lifted and put down again. They're re-inking their pen over and over again, okay? There's a lot of sort of mechanics involved, actually. And those mechanics create opportunity for their eye to skip from the same word to the same word without realizing they're actually in a different place in the source manuscript. So what happens is
I'm amazed by it.
Omission, okay, where the scribe has copied the one word in his new manuscript, and he knows which word he needs to go back to, right? Because he just copied that. And he does. He goes back to that same word in the text, or maybe it's the same ending of a word, and picks up copying there without realizing he's just left out something in the middle, okay? Let me give you listeners an illustration, okay? Back when I was in my PhD, I got to take a trip to a little city in northern Italy, and because it's Italy, okay, their public library has several Greek New Testament manuscripts. Okay, this is the beauty of Europe. Yeah. And so the man who's my host, the scholar who was hosting me at his university, I asked him if he'd take me to the library and help get me access to it. So he did. And this manuscript is, I think, from something like the 14th century. And I can spend the afternoon with it. It's a complete New Testament, which makes it fairly rare. And on almost every single page, there were corrections in the margin. Okay.
Okay.
So just page after page after page, corrections in the margin. So sometimes it was like a phrase. Sometimes it was almost a whole verse. Okay.
So by correction in the margin, you mean that the scribe realized his mistake and just notes it?
That's it.
Okay. Yeah, because you can't exactly undo what you just did.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
There's no control Z.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, no.
So they would make a note of themselves like, oh,
That's it. That's it. So one I love to show people is one of the first page of Mark's gospel, okay, right at the beginning of his copying. I think he's made a mistake in the very first verse, actually, the very first line. But then later on the page, he's made the exact same mistake, and it's the kind of that I just described to you.
Yeah.
And in that case, he actually tried to correct it between the lines. Okay, he started to write it mid-line, and then you can see he crossed that out because he realized, oh shoot, the omission was much bigger than I thought. I can't actually fit it there. So then he's just gone over to the margin again, written it there, and he just creates a little symbol, a little cross-referencing symbol, puts the symbol in the text, and then out in the margin to show when you're reading, when you get to that little symbol, just jump over to the margin and keep reading from there, and then come back to where you left off. So I think that manuscript illustrates a couple things. One, it illustrates the kind of mistakes that scribes make. It illustrates that they sometimes caught their own mistakes and corrected them. And that's really important because that sort of shows the lie of the telephone game analogy, right? In the telephone game analogy, nobody is allowed to stop and go back to the person in front of it and say that again so I can make sure I got it right. Or, and this is something scribes could do, or jump back in line. Yeah?
Yeah.
Imagine how the telephone game would work if the person 5 people in was able to go back to the second person and say, what did you say? He just skipped everything in between. You see? And then add multiple lines of transmission. So you start with one person with the message in the middle, and let's say there's 5 lines of the telephone game, and every person in that line, or say every other person in all 5 of those lines, is allowed to jump the line. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a very different thing than the telephone game, where in the telephone game, things only ever get worse. The message only ever degenerates.
Well, there's this, so there's this perspective out there that is pushed, unfortunately, that the text that I have right here is a translation of another one that was done in the 50s, which is a translation of another one that was done in the 1800s, of another one done, etc. So speak to me just real quickly on the variations that we have between the newest translations that we have that use all of the available information that we have because of textual criticism, the variance of those texts to, let's say, the King James Bible, when the King James Bible was first done, there's only a handful of manuscripts that they had access to. Right.
Yep. So people often think, and some of this is understandable, if an older Greek manuscript is better than a later one, then we might also assume the same thing is true of English translation. An older translation is better. And look, I don't want to disparage the King James because it's a wonderful translation in its time. It's still worth reading. I know my own mother, I think, still reads it for her devotion. So I'm
great.
not going to criticize it. But people have this misconception that somehow they must have had more manuscripts back then, and actually they had access to fewer. They just hadn't been able to do the work yet. One reason, okay, there's a lot I could go into on this, by the way. So I'm just scratching the surface.
Thank you for trying to summarize it and simplify it.
And maybe
I know that's
if I
hard.
could put a plug in, you don't have it, but I've just got a new book called Scribes and Scriptures out.
Okay.
That tells the whole story of the Bible, everything from the invention of the alphabet all the way to English translation. Okay, so
I'll put a link to that and text so people can find that and buy it.
If people are interested, they can go there. But the idea that you should translate the Bible from Greek was still pretty new when the King James was translated. I mean, William Tyndale decides to do this in the 1500s, and less than 100 years later, you get the King James. So the idea of translating the English Bible from the Greek is still fairly new, and it's a Protestant distinctive. The Roman Catholics had translated the English Bible just a few years before the King James, and they used the Latin Vulgate, not the Greek New Testament. So in that case, you are dealing with a translation of a translation, but not in the case of the King James. Now, what is true is the King James is a revision of a previous English Bible, known as the Bishop's Bible, which is itself a revision of a former English translation, which eventually does go back to Tyndale. And most English translations are, in fact, revisions of earlier translations for the very simple reason, okay, that translating the Bible is a lot of work. And doing it from scratch is a lot of work without a lot of necessary payoff, frankly, for the translator, okay? So most translation teams would much prefer to start from an existing translation and revise it further. So that's true today. The NASB, the ESV, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the NRSV, these are all revisions. Even the NIV today that you buy off the shelf is from 2011, which is a revision of the 1984, which is itself a revision of, I think, the 1970, I forget the date, okay, when the original NIV came out. So, but back to your question, why are modern translations based on a better Greek text? For the simple reason that we've discovered far more manuscripts since 1611, and we have studied them in far more detail than they did in 1611. So I like to say they did the very best they could in 1611. And there are dozens of marginal notes in the King James Version that sometimes King James onlyists aren't aware of that give different readings from those manuscripts that they did know of. So they were well aware of the need for textual criticism in 1611. They just didn't have as many manuscripts to do it with. Okay, so people should have more trust. If the King James Version is a good Bible, and it is, okay, your English version that you pull off the shelf today, especially if it's a mainstream translation, I'm not talking about some of the funky, weird ones like the Passion Translation, okay, but any mainstream translation is even better. Even better. So I always like to say it's not a choice between good and bad when you're dealing with translations. It's a choice between good and a bit better.
And I
sense?
appreciate that. It absolutely makes sense. And I appreciate that. And I still enjoy, whenever I'm doing a study, I love to use the resources that compare the translations.
Yes.
So that you can see blueletterbible .org is a phenomenal one where you're able to just click a button and see all the different translations that are there. The point that I'm getting at in comparing the King James to a modern translation is, despite the disparity of time and the number of manuscripts, can you speak just briefly about the total percentage of change in between? So this is what I want to hit on the fact that across thousands of years, with our oldest manuscripts that we have to those Bibles, to the newest manuscripts that we found, how much variation in the text is there?
Yeah, okay. So you could compare, a good way to see this in English is you could compare the King James Version with the New King James Version. Okay. And the New King James Version has marginal notes at every place where its text, and it's the same Greek text as the King James, differs from the Greek text behind modern translations like the NIV or ESV. Okay. Now this is not exact because translation teams make their own textual decisions, and so it's not
They have to.
100. It's not 100%, but this is it's very close. Okay, it's very good. And you could just go through your New King James and see every place where the differences behind the Greek, okay, the differences in the Greek behind them affects the translation. I honestly do not know what the number is, but it's probably, I would guess it's in the number of 1,000 or a couple thousand. The first revision, the first major revision of the King James Version is known as the Revised Version. It came out in 1881. There were about 6,000 changes to the Greek text behind that between the King James and that. Not all of them are translatable, okay? But there are about 6,000. So it's probably more than you might think.
Yeah.
But it's not enough that somehow, it changed the message of the Bible in some sort of way. And, I mean, King James onlyists think it did, but I think that's absurd, frankly. I don't want to make it out that none of the changes are significant or none of them matter for interpretation. Some do. But look, frankly, the Bible is so consistent with itself, that the kind of changes and the number of changes we're talking about do not rise to the level that it can somehow change the fundamental message.
I recall reading something along the lines of a 2% change overall from the oldest manuscripts we have to today. Is that accurate?
I'd have to think about the percentage. I mean, what I could say is I could show you an early manuscript like P46, okay, and I could compare it to a medieval manuscript, say, that was behind the King James Version.
Yeah.
And they would agree with each other probably in the range of 85 to 90% of the time.
And those percentages of time, so like with the translations that we have now in comparison, of those variations that exist, how much of them are significant? What percentage of those are actually significant to the text?
Okay, I wish I had my book with me. I'd give you the exact numbers. I left it at home. I'm sorry. But in the book, I give exact numbers. It's in Mistakes too. I do it with in the new book. I use a different chapter of the New Testament, but it's the same basic point. And take the Gospel of John. Okay, chapter 18 of John. We have really complete data to work with of nearly 2,000 manuscript copies of John 18. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there are about 800 words in Greek in John 18, and there are several thousand variants between those 2,000 manuscripts. Okay,
Wow.
there's a lot. There's, and Bart Ehrman, who's a kind of famous agnostic on Christianity, likes to say there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament, and statistically, he's right about that. There's just simply no arguing with that way of putting it. He's right. What's wrong is that I think he's given a false comparison there. Okay. Because scribes only make mistakes as they're making a new copy. So a better comparison would be to say, how many variants do we have per word they had to copy? And in John 18, based on my own research that I've done on this, they made a mistake for every about 400 words they had to copy. Well, that's half the chapter. That's really not that bad.
No.
When you think about it.
And especially considering what they're doing and how they're doing it.
That's it. And then to your question, you're saying, okay, but how many of those matter? Right off the bat, about half of them, okay, are nonsense readings, which is the technical term that we scholars use. And this is the rare place where our technical term is exactly what it sounds like.
Nonsense. I love it.
A nonsense reading doesn't make sense because the scribe just flubbed, okay? Like the example I always give is if I'm typing an email and I write the word the, but I spell it T-E-H, okay? Anybody reading my email knows exactly what I meant to type, okay? Even though it's not what I did in fact type. That's a nonsense reading. Okay.
So half of them we can toss out.
Half of them you immediately toss out. Okay. Then you can whittle that down and say, okay, these other ones maybe make some sense. They're not complete nonsense, but they're found in so few manuscripts, or they're just such obvious mistakes that we can also discard those. Okay. By the time you get to a technical commentary on John, okay, they might discuss something like, I don't know, 12 of them.
Okay.
Okay. Get to your English Bible and the footnotes of your English Bible. I don't think I've seen an English Bible yet that has a single footnote of a variant in John 18.
Why is that?
Because the translators have gone through the variants and said, none of these are either so difficult to resolve or affect the translation that we need to alert the English Bible reader about them. Do you see?
Yeah.
Now, one thing I always stress when I talk about this question is I say, when we ask the question, how many variants matter, we have to qualify and say, matter to whom? Who do they matter to? I'm a scholar. I study these things for a living. The variants, even the ones that are obvious mistakes, still have a lot to teach me about the way scribes did their work.
About the actual process of transmission and the text itself, not necessarily the inspired word of God.
That's it. So as my supervisor, my PhD supervisor used to always remind me, he'd say, you learn the most about scribes when they make mistakes. When they do everything right, you don't really learn anything about the way scribes work. But, just to give a really concrete example of the way, that listeners would not think about, I would not have thought about it, but my supervisor is smarter than I am. He at one point thought, I bet scribes tend to make mistakes where they had to re-ink the pen.
Oh.
Because anytime the scribe's eye has to come off the page and they have to do something else, there's an opportunity to just make a mistake at that point. And he found there's a little bit of a correlation between places where you can see where the scribe re-inked the pen in the manuscript because the ink gets thicker at that point, and where he made mistakes. It doesn't mean that every time he re-inked the pen, he made a mistake. It just means that re-inking the pen is an opportunity to create a mistake. Okay. And so again, as a scholar, I want to know about all the variants. Even the nonsense ones, because I learn about scribes from those. Sometimes I learn a lot, actually. They can be very instructive. And then learning from those obvious mistakes can help me resolve the less obvious mistakes. Do you see?
Yeah,
so they're actually really useful to me. But to my mom reading her devotions in the morning, does she want all the nonsense readings listed in her English Bible? Of course not. Of course not. So it's part of the job of a scholar like me to actually do that filtering work for the layperson and say, here's what you most need to know. Okay. And the footnotes of your English Bible are sort of a good rough and ready gauge to know what do scholars think are the most important things for me to know. So I would say to people, if you want to know where these important variants are in your Bible, it's very simple. All you have to do is read your footnotes.
Yeah. The footnotes are phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. Most people don't. I understand. Okay. They're not, the most exciting part of the Bible. They shouldn't be, frankly. But that's where they are. It's not like a conspiracy that we're trying to hide these things from you all.
No, and that's what I love is that it's honest. It says, okay, early manuscripts don't include this this line, or it could also mean this. And a person who wants to dig deeper, there's so many resources out there.
Yeah.
And so to wrap up this conversation on textual criticism, I love the fact that there is a science out there that is digging into our ancient texts that we have, but at the same time, to me, when I did that textual criticism class, and still as a study of it on my own, it revalidates that this is God's word to us, and that we can put our weight into that, and that we can know for certainty that despite these little tiny variations, it is miraculous to me that over 2,000 years for the New Testament and many more for the Old Testament, the gospel is preached, the gospel is shared, and we can be saved through this amazing word of God.
Right.
It's phenomenal.
I think it's absurd to think that the few places, the places where we're still in some doubt about what the original text is, would somehow overwhelm our confidence in the places where we know without question what it says, and then think about what those places teach. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, to sort of, and I'm a text critic, so I pay attention to these things for a living. I'm not trying to downplay their significance. There are places where the differences matter. We as Christians need to engage this work. That's why I do what I do. So you're not going to hear me disparage the work of textual criticism or say it's unnecessary or that it's all done, that there's nothing left to do. I'm not saying that either. But what I am saying is the places where the text is sure, it's so sure, and what it says is so clear, and so monumentally significant in what it claims. You see, in other words, for a person to get distracted by the variance and miss sort of the Bible's claims that Jesus lived the life he lived, died the death he did, rose, and is ascended to heaven, and now sits at the right hand of God the Father, and will come again to judge the living and the dead, as the creed says. Okay?
Yeah.
That's the forest, friends.
Yeah.
And if we miss that forest because there are some trees that we're not sure about in the forest, we have really, what the British would say, we've lost the plot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well said, sir. Well, thank you for the work that you do in textual criticism, and I'm excited that you're not done. We're finding out new things. We're finding new manuscripts, digging in. And you actually mentioned it in one of your books, the fact that one of the modern translations made the claim that there will never be another need for another translation of their version. And then they redacted that 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, because that's just not realistic. Language is changing. And that's a separate conversation on translation.
Sure.
But so I still want to be true to our mission here. Clearly, this has been a passion your entire life.
Yeah, this goes back to, certainly at some degree goes back to high school, but then it really, text criticism in particular was in college. But yeah, it's been a while now.
So how can a person who is a young person who is still figuring out what they want to do for a living, or how they want to answer God's call, because both of those are significant and they can be interconnected. If a person wants to get into doing what you did and do now, and go and look at those manuscripts and do that for a living, how can they, what's the path? What would you recommend?
Come study with me at Phoenix Seminary. If you really want to do this at the academic level, it's going to require a lot of language learning. You've got to know Greek well.
School.
Ideally, if you can learn Latin, Syriac, that's ideal, or maybe Coptic in place of one of those. But that's the gist. You got to learn languages really well, because you got to work with manuscripts and think about grammar and syntax and what we call philology, which is sort of the broad conception of thinking about language. And I started Greek in high school. You don't have to do that, but plenty of my students come to seminary having done an undergraduate degree in, say, engineering or finance or whatever.
Oh, wow.
And they go on to do very well in the languages and go on to get a PhD, and then they become academics themselves. So, if the best thing I could say is, if the thing you really need to answer is, how interested are you in it?
Yeah.
Right. Are you interested to the degree where it's one among many interests and you just want to keep reading and learning about it? In that case, go to our website. There's lots of great informative articles there you can scratch your itch with. But if that's not enough, then that's where you can't get enough.
So
That's
perhaps
when you know you do more school.
going down the path of going to seminary and taking a class in textual criticism, among many, also taking Greek and Hebrew, etc. I mean, that starts the process. And if you realize that God is calling you to do more down this path, then there are avenues to do that.
That's right. Yep. So I teach the basic degree for a pastor is what's called the MDiv, the Master of Divinity.
Yep.
And that requires Greek and Hebrew. And then if you do want more, we teach what's called a THM, a Master of Theology. And in that degree program, I teach a whole semester on just New Testament textual criticism. And every class we're reading from a different Greek manuscript. Just throw it up on the screen and we read from it, and just learning about all the ins and outs, learning about the history of the discipline, learning about the different editions, all that stuff. And it's a lot of fun, frankly. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I do this in particular is one, just because I like it. I have a bit of a knack for it, or at least I've been trained to have a knack for it.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. I mean, it's just when you get to actually work with the manuscripts, each one is individual, each one is unique, because they are literally handcrafted, in the full sense of the word.
Yeah.
And I always like to say each manuscript has a bit of its own story to tell, and it's there for us to learn if we pay close attention to it.
Well, there's no question God has gifted you with a desire, but also a passion and a brain to handle this sort of stuff. And I will say, listening to the work that you do and the science that you do, I am happy to read your conclusions and to benefit from it as I do study myself and studying the Bible. But we need people like you that have the brains and the capacity to dig in deep to ask the question of, okay, well, why is that the way it is? Right. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I think we need to think about the Bible as a stewardship. And the more I've studied the history of the Bible, the more and more I come to this conclusion and realize how much I have to be thankful for the people who've handed it down to me. And that has left me more and more thinking, okay, my job is not to sort of like do all the work there is to do and give the definitive answer to whatever the question is. It's more a question of faithfulness to me now. Maybe this is me getting a bit older than when I was younger, but I feel more and more as the years pass that my job is to hand on a good stewardship to the next generation. Because as the church, the Bible is our book. And we have a responsibility to take good care of it, to study it, to know where it came from, and then to hand that off to the next generation, right? So whether that's in the form of translation or in the form of creating a new critical edition of the Greek New Testament, or doing a very careful study of one particular manuscript, there's all sorts of ways to contribute, but my job is to make the most faithful contribution I can make in my one area, so I can then hand that legacy off to the next generation, hopefully let them run even further than I could with it.
And I feel like that's the role of all Christians, of being a good steward. I really like the way that you wrap that up. That was very well said. So if somebody wants to connect with you or find your books or dig into the work that you do, give me some references of places that they can go.
Sure. So probably the best place to go is our website, textandcanon.org, and there you'll find articles. If you click on the articles tab, you can filter by author, so you can see the articles I've written there. You can find me at our seminary website, ps.edu. I also write for a blog. If you really get into this stuff, okay, the nerdy website is Evangelical Textual Criticism. And that's a blog that I've been part of for, goodness, I don't know, coming on 10 years now. The blog's older than that. I've read it since I was in Bible college, and it's part of what got me hooked on this whole thing. So if you really want to nerd out on that stuff, that's the place to really go, because they're the
nerds collect.
That's right. The training wheels come off the bike there. Okay, and we really ride. But if you still want the training wheels on, go to textandcanon.org. I'm on Twitter as well. You can follow me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. As we close, I would like to pray for you and the work that you're doing and for textual critics. So those that are listening or watching, why don't you join us? Lord, thank you. Thank you for the work that Peter is doing in textual criticism, and for the passion that he has, and for all of those that are out there that are, as he said, being good stewards of what you have passed to us. Thank you for the miraculous work that you have done in the creation of this book. It's not one author. It is you inspiring hundreds and hundreds of people that through history have all worked together to create this, but it is your book. It is you speaking to us through it. And I am so grateful that I, as a Christ follower today, can stand on that. Thank you that you love us as much as you do. Thank you that you have given this miraculous text that we can learn more about who you are, your character, and what you have for us. Please continue to work through Peter, bless him, and continue to work through all the textual critics that are doing your work. We love you, Lord, and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks a lot, Dave. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks for the time, brother. I appreciate it. And I have a feeling this will not be our last conversation.
It's been my pleasure talking to you.